developed, quote unquote, ranking on the economic scale. And many economies in the region of Southeast Asia have matured or are maturing rapidly through the middle income economic quality. But at the same time, this ASEAN economic emergence in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, where we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars poured into government agencies such as JAKIM or quasi-governmental organizations such as the Indonesian Ulama Council, which actively police and regulate what they deem to be, quote unquote, acceptable faith practices for those who identify or are forced to identify by their constitution as Muslim. We have not seen democratic development accompanying such economic development, as though we have seen elsewhere, for example, in places like Thailand and South Korea, like Taiwan and South Korea. Something is clearly missing. In fact, aren't we seeing, as the title of this panel suggests, a slouching toward authoritarianism in the region? Well, ascertaining what this is might be beyond the mandate of the Commission. Discussing its effects in regards to religious freedom falls squarely within our sphere of responsibility. So with all this in mind, I'd like to encourage our guests today, our esteemed guests today, to consider a few questions during our conversation. What are the real or potential effects on religious freedom of rising authoritarianism and the shrinking of civil society space in Southeast Asia? What can the US government do to meet these challenges and build relationships with our partners in the region to ensure the protection of this basic human right and fundamental freedom? With that, let me turn it back to Patrick. Patrick.
Thank you, Commissioners, for this valuable insight into the current state of affairs in Southeast Asia, as we at USCIRF understand it, as well as our objectives for today's conversation. Without further hesitation, I would like to welcome our first panelist, Dr. Dan Slater, to provide some further context and his expertise. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Slater.
Well, thanks very much for having me, for the commission and everyone involved. It's an important session. As one of the commissioners mentioned, Southeast Asia is too often ignored. I think Asia is often seen as China and nothing but. So to be able to pay attention to other parts of Asia is really, really important. I think it makes a lot of sense that Vietnam and Burma receive the lion's share of attention when we're looking at questions of the connection between authoritarianism and religious freedom or lack thereof. But Indonesia and Malaysia are both have exhibited some worrisome signs. And so I'm glad that they're on the agenda for our conversation today. And so just to say a bit about myself, I'm primarily a student of authoritarianism and democratization. This is my main area. I work on, I direct the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. And so what I'd like to do is situate some of these questions about religious freedom in these questions of regime change. And not just of rising authoritarianism, but also of, in some ways, increased at least pluralization, and in some ways democratization that have taken place in recent decades in Indonesia and Malaysia. And what I'm going to want to call attention to in particular is the changing structure of party politics and the way that it connects to questions of religion, and particularly how religion relates to questions of government and opposition. Okay, so one thing to say at the outset about Indonesia and Malaysia is that concerns about religious freedom there, I think, are long-standing, and that they're sort of endemic to both countries. So in neither Indonesia or Malaysia do people really have freedom of religious conscience, in the sense that Indonesia has its national philosophy Pancasila, which begins with the premise that all Indonesians must believe in a singular God. So one does not have the option of not believing in a singular God to be Indonesian. Also, being even within Islam, there's a great deal of policing, and both societally and by the government of minority views such as Shia Islam, for instance, the Ahmadiyya group in Indonesia. And so one shouldn't, it's not like India. So India is secular. Indonesia is not secular. Okay. In Malaysia, and then by contrast as well, there, to be, if one is a member of the majority ethnic group, the Malay ethnic group, one must profess Islam as one's religion. One does not have the right to apostasy, if you will. One does not have the right to change religion. So these are not wrapped up with questions of authoritarianism. These are questions of how the nation was defined in the first place. So these are chronic concerns, issues, and inclinations toward a restriction of full religious liberty in both contexts. And I would also say, again, although rising authoritarianism is capturing our attention, Southeast Asia has been overwhelmingly a region of authoritarian regimes, since these countries gained independence, or since World War II. So restrictions on religious freedom and authoritarianism are part of the ongoing condition in this region and in Indonesia and Malaysia. But what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is call attention to the fact that things have changed in an important way in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they bear watching. So for about 30 years, from the 1960s to the 1990s, both Indonesia and Malaysia were ruled by dominant authoritarian groups. So this was the authoritarian government was sectarian. So in both Indonesia and Malaysia, these were multi-religious, multi-ethnic authoritarian governments, which did include minority religions and minority ethnic groups inside these authoritarian governments, in the coalitions that ruled these governments. And the oppositions to these authoritarian governments were also multi-ethnic, also multi-religious. And so in the case of Indonesia, as I mentioned, this notion of Pancasila, which again, though it does require religion, it does specify that Islam is not the official language the official religion of Indonesia. And therefore, in the case of Indonesia, that you had the Suharto regime, for all of its human rights abuses, was committed to Pancasila. It was an anti-Islamist authoritarian government in many ways. And similarly, in Malaysia, the UMNO or BN regime, culminating in the rule of Mahathir Mohamad, always had ethnic minority, religious minority parties as part of the ruling BN coalition. And again, so there was a real commitment to preventing Islamism from becoming the creed of the state in both places. And I think one reason these regimes lasted so long was because a lot of people supported them, despite their again, human rights abuses and other forms of authoritarian measures. They supported them because they saw them as champions of pluralism. These were governments that were, again, they were at least a barrier between society and outright Islamization, so the Iran scenario, for instance, right? So what has happened now? Well, what's happened now, so after the Asian financial crisis in 1998, this really shattered the hegemony and the domination of these authoritarian groups in both Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia became a democracy almost right away. It has remained a democracy for about 25 years. And there's been a great deal of power sharing across both Islamic political parties and nationalist political parties. Again, not secular, but more nationalist political parties. Malaysia had a much more, the dominant authoritarian regime stayed in power through the financial crisis. And it's been a much slower process of gradually through elections, the opposition in Malaysia has finally broken through and put the former ruling party, UMNO, into opposition. Now, what that has meant, rather interestingly, so again, a big reason for the fear of democracy in Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia and Malaysia, has been the fear of Islamism, the fear of a tyranny of the majority, a fear that the religious majority would assert its religious principles at the expense of religious minorities. Now, in point of fact, what has happened with democratization is what we see is religiously pluralistic governments in both cases. So it has not been the case that purely Islamic political forces have gained power in either Indonesia or in Malaysia. So the fear that democracy would lead to this tyranny of the majority, particularly a religious majority, has not come to fruition. However, what has happened is, although there are pluralist forces within government in both places, the opposition in both Indonesia and Malaysia has taken on a very much an Islamist cast. So what we have now that we did not have during the authoritarian period is that we now have a situation in which government and opposition are actually distinguished by their views on religion and their commitments to pluralism. During the authoritarian heyday from the 60s to the 90s, both the authoritarian government and the democratic opposition was broadly pluralistic, okay, or at least was multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Now it's the case, especially in Malaysia, that the opposition is a strictly Islamic opposition. And it is only parties within government that have any expressed commitment to religious pluralism. And what that means is it's taken on a very worrisome ethno-religious coloration. So in the past, fights over democracy and authoritarianism were not really fights about religion. But now that both places are more pluralistic, more democratic, actually fights are more directly about religion. And what we're seeing is more pressure from opposition groups to bring more religious laws and religious restrictions on board. I think this is something Hashim will probably talk about. And so what we see is, again, it's a government versus opposition dynamic that was not the case under authoritarianism, but is the case under democracy. So it's not so much the governments in power have moved in really, really worrisome ways. I think there's certainly some cause for concern, but the main concern in both Indonesia and Malaysia is not in the ruling government. In both cases, it's in the opposition and the way the opposition is going to possibly push for greater restrictions and a more dominant role for Islam specifically as the religion of the nation. So I will stop my comments there and let's move things along.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Slater, for that input and that insight. We will now hear from Hisham Mahimi, calling in from Kuala Lumpur.
Hello, everyone. Hisham Mahimi here. I'm the project coordinator at the Initiative to Promote Tolerance and Prevent Violence. We are an organization that is originated and established by former radicalized youth committed to prevent violent extremism. Now, I think what I'm going to present right now is basically a more in-depth extension to what Dan has covered. I sort of like base how I was given the question on how, authoritarian or non-democratic tactic used by the state and political parties to maintain religious freedom and dimension. I based this presentation and discussion on our work at Initiate.my. We built two databases earlier last year to document two things. First is on the legislation and gazetted fatwas from 1980s to 2020-21 to measure the level of restriction on legislation, on laws and legislations and fatwas in Malaysia. This is basically the number of restrictions according to states, the count of fatwas, and the count of provisions which exist in state enactments and acts, which Sharia laws govern. We have 14 states in Malaysia, so each state has different Sharia laws to one another. This is more like the more in-depth sort of. And then the second database is on the cases of tension and conflicts motivated by religious hatred and racism in Malaysia from the period 2004, 2020, 21. We studied this period because our early analysis was that post-2018 general election, for the first time that the UMNO and BN government, lose their power to the opposition was post-May 2018 general election recorded the highest number of intergroup conflicts and tensions in the country. So we study 4 types of events: protests, terrorism, vigilantism, and violent clash. Our observations basically are according to 2 levels. Number 1, at the state level, there is a hegemonic legal restriction on religious freedoms. And second, at the society level, which derive directly from what happens at the state level, is that there is alarming cases of religious intolerance for hegemonic political goal. Going specific, this is the number of provisions and fatwas that we have collected. You can see we record here the type of offense includes anti-blasphemy, apostasy, persecution of religious minorities, persecution of sexual minorities, and persecution of critical thinking culture. These are the number of provisions and fatwas that we have collected. And then on a general level, basically, there is a broad and overlapping legal provisions. Like if your insult to religion and authority can also be deemed as like an act of like public indecency and immorality. And how there's a lot of broad fatwas as well that bans pluralism and liberalism, anti-LGBT, anti-liberal fatwas, the use of the word Allah by non-Muslims, which is deemed exclusive to only Muslims. And also there's a lot of fatwas banning denominations such as Shia and Ahmadiyas in Malaysia. At the state level, right? So basically what is recognized here, although it is not mentioned in Article 3, what constitutes Islam in Malaysia, But in practice, Sunni Islam is the legal and legitimate version of Islam in the public space. And based on these fatwas and legislations that we have collected, religious authorities, they have a very broad power to interpret and enforce laws without proper oversight. So you can be charged for criticizing religious institution, in the name of insult to religion and authority. The state basically dictates how Islam should be practiced in public life, although it only covers Muslims. Non-Muslims are also impacted, which I will later explore. Also, as a result of this, there is a state-sponsored discrimination against minority groups to peacefully express their religion, their belief, and their thoughts. Now, going on the societal level observation, which I've done cover at the state level, right? So there is a mobilization of general public to affect regressive policy change and extreme actions. You can see this graph here. So basically, it reached its peak in the year 2018. It's not recorded here, but then it falls down after 2019, which is where the regime in Malaysia changed after the Sheraton move, which UMNO BN took over back the power. And at the societal level observation, also, I mentioned the exclusive court rule that they can use the word Allah. And a month after that, there was a 10 attacks and attempted attacks in various locations in Malaysia, targeting religious minorities or places of worship, mostly at church. And we're not sure whether these are planned, coordinated, or uncoordinated. So you can see like there is a direct linkage between what happens, what has been normalized at the state level, and what has been, normalized at the societal level based on the Sunni Muslim hegemony. There are other trends that includes Squad Bada, which is a moral vigilantism. Basically, they are public individuals. They don't have any power. They are not empowered under the law. They took the laws into their own hands and try to police people morally, and advising. And some of these cases also infringe the businesses of non-Muslims in specific areas in Malaysia. The use of social media is also part of the equation where political parties try to paint and public shape certain narrative. This is one of the prominent person in Malaysia, the president of the party, Islamic party in Malaysia. Basically, when I talk about fatwas, which is a ruling edict, right? It is an opinion which is issued by a scholar of Islam, and then as a Muslim, you should follow it because it's your religious duties. So what this person made was during the rally against ICERT in 2018, he issued a fatwa saying that it is mandatory to, join the protest because it's a religious duty for you to do that, and not doing it is a sin on your part. So what happened was there was about 55,000 people took this to the street in Kuala Lumpur in a protest in response to ICERT. And also some of the most, one of the current trends that we see last year during November, the general election, the 15th general election, we see the first time where political parties, particularly the Perikatan Nasional, the coalition of PAS, and also the Bersatu, they took to the TikTok for the first time to influence how voting is, how young people votes. We passed the Undi 18, which is the 18 years old. So people of 18 years old automatically can vote for the first time without registering themselves. And then there's a lot of think tanks that says that, things might change for Malaysia, but it took a dark turn because PAS is one of those parties that secure the highest number of seats from the past general election. So there's a lot of fear-mongering and tactics and call to violence message by Perikatan Nasional. You can see the image of Keris here, which is the Malay daggers calling to violence. And also there's an inspiration to jihad here. This is where Pematang Pau, youth, they're inspired by the people during the prophets, so wartime, using a horse, and flags used by ISIS and, prophets during the times, during war times back in history. So this has created very pervasive impacts in the society. Like I said, the Sunni Islam hegemony, it promotes this, that is promoted by the state. It creates an enabling and conducive environment of intolerance to thrive. There's also the normalization of coercion that targets minority groups such as Shia and religious minorities, the church case that I mentioned earlier. And because of this, the group grievances, there's a group grievance among minority groups as a result of state societal level discrimination and injustice. There's no recourse for them to address this. Yeah. I think I'm going to stop here for now. Thank you.
Hisham, thank you for that testimony. That was really informative. And I thank both you and Dr. Slater, for taking a subject that spans over 600 million people and 10 countries and condensing it down to 10 minutes for us to digest. Before I start with the comments or remarks or initial questions they might have.
Thank you, Patrick. Maybe I'll jump in first here. A question for Mr. Slater. What about this? How do you judge the strength of the Indonesian constitution? They obviously have some protections there. That doesn't stop the development of these larger cultural tsunamis that occasionally come up that you're referring to. But how do you judge that as it relates to religious freedom, the strength of the Indonesian constitution?
Well, that's a pretty simple one, I'm afraid. It's extremely weak. The Indonesian legal system is extremely weak. And there's a very big difference between Malaysia and Indonesia in that regard. I mean, Malaysia is a former British colony, has a much more developed legal system. Decisions go through the law more. You can actually count on the written law mattering more. Indonesian law has always been very, much weaker protections. And this is one area where I think rising authoritarianism is really a concern. In Indonesia, part of what's happening with the democratic backsliding going on with the Jokowi government in Indonesia has been, I think, increasing concerns about the independence of the constitutional court as well. So I would say it is constitutions are always, I think, as pretty thin protections. A place like India, there's so much national investment in and kind of national identity wrapped around the constitution that I think it's a little bit of a special case. In Indonesia, I wouldn't expect the constitution to provide much protection at all.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Hisham. Forgive me if I mispronounced your name there. I'm familiar with, and I have particular interest in the case of Pastor Raymond Coe, who just a few years ago in February was kidnapped, we assume dead. It highlighted, at least it hinted to the re-education camps that the government has. That's what I call them, where people who have veered from a certain part of Islam into another part of Islam or into atheism or any other sort of what some in the government consider divergent thought are put into some kind of a detainment. What can you speak to that? Do you know that if that is the complexity of those systems, if they exist? Mr. Slater, you can address it too, but I'll at least initially maybe ask Hisham to answer that.
I'm not actually sure about that. I think there are some people in the audience who are also Malaysian can also answer it better. But on my part, I'm not sure, or at least we don't make it is not make it known like whether there is like a secret service behind that sort of like try to re-educate this person. People who tries to what they call it, tries to challenge the public interest. But I also, but I am aware of that. If you're a Muslim, tries to challenge, a certain laws or questions. If you are like being considered as a deviant, there is a re-education camp for that. Although it is not necessarily mandatory. I have some friends who are being detained, I think, who are being called upon, but then they're there's nothing, when they do not go, there's nothing happens against them. Yeah. Yeah. Hope that answered the question. Maybe Dan has like a slightly better answer for that.
Before, I just want to make sure I understand. So re-education camp exist. They exist. They're not mandatory. Why would somebody go if they themselves have an opinion on a particular part of faith? Why would they go if they weren't forced to go?
So basically, if you're Muslims in Malaysia, you cannot leave the religion. Like theologically speaking, when you leave Islam, you are legalized. Your blood is legal to be murdered by other Muslims, but subject with a certain conditions I have to fulfill. For example, 3 times of advice, and then things like that. But in Malaysia, we do it is. Those kind of laws is basically ultra vires with the constitution. There's actually one, I think it's Terengganu tries to pass a hudud laws, but then it was unconstitutional, confuse it with offenses, other offenses. I think I'm not sure the status of this kind of offenses. If you're being detained for apostasy, it is mandatory for you to go. But if you are detained under other laws such as immoral activities under the prosecution of sexual or gender minorities, you can actually opt to not go, and there's nothing going to happen against you. It's just basically a class to teach them you back about religion. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Slater, do you want to comment on the
re-education? Yeah, I think there's like a specific comment that's, I think, speaks to a broader point, which is, so why would people like enter into these kinds of arrangements? And I think that, a lot of what Hisham was talking about is the fact that, religious repression, religious control in these societies largely emanates from society. It doesn't only emanate from government policy. And so these are not very liberal societies. These are places where there is a lot of emphasis, societally speaking, placed on, being religiously upright. And those who deviate in any way will tend to be ostracized and face a lot of social sanctions. Arguably, vigilantism, anti-religious minority vigilantism in Indonesia is a bigger concern than government regulations. So I think I would just want to make sure we're attuned to the fact that it's not as if you have this highly pluralistic liberal society and then governments are repressing them, right? These are places where people, a variety of restrictions on and social sanctions against practicing their religion in a diverse way that their consciences might push them to do. And I think we saw that. I think that came through Hisham's talk really nicely, but I just wanted to really make sure we were paying attention to that fact, because yes, this is a government agency, this is government appointed agency, a commission, right? So it makes sense to think of what are governments doing to restrict religion, but understanding the context really requires attention to society as well.
That's a good point. I just wanted to follow up one thing with Hisham. You mentioned gender and sexual minorities. Were you referring to the Mukhayam programs with that? And then, yeah.
No, that was on another thing. I think Mukhayam, I'm not sure about the status right now, but I was referring to another raid, which happens basically last Halloween. There was like a big raid in Kuala Lumpur. There's a lot of like the Islamic Affairs Department come and clamp down people who are partying out there, particularly like in the LGBT or gender sexual minority scene where they are. And then like there's a total number of people who are being detained, and they were required to attend counseling or re-education session. It's not a camp. I think it's like 1 or 2 sessions for 2 hours like that. Yeah, so that's basically what I was referring to before.
All right, thank you.
I wonder if I could, I actually have 100 questions, but let me just keep this brief. I have one really top level question to ask. I wonder to what extent the situations that we're seeing in Southeast Asia are idiosyncratic cases unique to themselves in regards to the rising authoritarianism in the region, and to what extent they're reflective of the larger global phenomenon that we see in places like India and Turkey, and we could kind of go through a long list there. Should we be focusing more on the particularities of Malaysia and Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and so forth, or should we? Is it better to use the wider lens to see the challenges to democracy generally, and the use of religion in those challenges to democracy worldwide here? And I offer that to both of you.
This is a great question. I think what I would say is, when trying to understand what's happening, to pay attention to these national contexts. But that being said, I agree with you completely that there are transnational phenomena going on. I mean, the changes within political Islam, and certainly not only political Islam, but because we're talking about two Muslim majority countries. Obviously, I could talk about how you look at the role of monks in Burma, who were very driven by a lot of the sort of the genocidal efforts we saw against the Rohingya and the Muslim minority in Burma. Very driven by looking around the world and seeing what they saw as Islamic terrorism in other parts of the world. I mean, when you look across Asia, I think there's a lot more violence against Muslim minorities than there is violence of Islamic majorities against non-Muslim minorities. So we can obviously think about Xinjiang, we can think about the Rakhine State, we can think about the Thai South, we can think about the Philippine South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say this is global, and one kind of interesting tidbit here. I was in Jakarta recently, and I was talking with a pollster, and they were saying, so we asked recently in a poll, who do Indonesians think our most important economic partner in the world is? Okay. So you think, well, maybe they'd say the US, maybe they'd say China. Anybody care to guess? Saudi Arabia. So the point being, and so because there are global flows of religious funding, education funding, infrastructure, these kinds of things, that for a lot of average Indonesians, what they encounter is they don't encounter Belt Road Initiative projects, they don't encounter American investments or Australian investments, they see these Saudi projects. And so there is certainly there are global things going on, and certainly varieties of Islam coming from outside of Southeast Asia are changing things. And Hisham mentioned in Malaysia, this new version of PAS. This is not like what PAS was like even 20, 30 years ago. It's a much more conservative version of PAS, and they do have the most seats in the Malaysian parliament at this point. So again, my main point: Indonesia, Malaysia, real grounds for concern in the political opposition in particular, rather than within government.
Thank you, Dan. I really like this question from Commissioner Schreck. I think to extend on Dan's response earlier, in my take in the ASEAN region, right, I think basically we can be categorized into two. Several countries that is facing violent action or violent threats, and several countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and maybe Singapore with non-violent conflicts, but non-violent extremism. I think what is the real thing that is considered like these three countries, like it's the similarities with other countries as well that has a Muslim majority countries. It's always about political Islam or Islamism, the threat towards conservatism, how these countries and regions, they inspire from one another. They learn how to bureaucratize religion and how to to have Islam more in the public space, to the learning and inspiring from each other. Basically, the idea is to have a modern but Islamic way of life, something like that. And I think also as a follow-up to Dan mentioned this earlier, how it's not essentially the authoritarianism does not only reinforced by the state actors, but it also comes from the non-state actors on the ground. Like in Malaysia, for example, right? If you say like non-state actors there's always individuals on the ground, and then like there's a lot of Islamist group, even though they have a very different ideas, approach to democracy, they have a different version of Islam. At the end of the day, their political goals are the same, and on certain things and on certain issues, they can band together and like learn from other regions and then unite themselves to respond to specific issues. For example, on the Rohingya during COVID, right? How we have an influx of Rohingyan citizens and immigrants in Malaysia, and then these Islamist actors, they are known to not be united on any specific issues, but for this first time, they did. For example, other things that I can see probably on the institutionalization of Islam in science, economy, like the halal certification, for example, and then which promotes more restrictions to the general public. I think if we try to like sort of like build linkages on this issue, we can draw similarities between several countries in Turkey, in Brunei, for example, and Indonesia, how a lot of these actors on the ground, they learn from one another and like importing ideas and then sort of like mirror each other's best practices. I hope that answers the questions.
Thank you both. I maybe offline, I can follow up with you both. I'm very interested in that topic. So thank you both.
We have a couple questions from the audience. I'll start with one real quick. This it concerns Vietnam. Do we have concerns over the authoritarianism and religious freedom connection there in that country? Do we have any thoughts about the military or police forces that are implemented to crack down on different religious groups within the country? Maybe can start with Dr. Slater.
Sure. Well, I think that, Vietnam, I think, is a pretty clear example, again, a la China, where, the authoritarianism and the religious repression go together. That it's not as if there's something special about being religious civil society in a single party state, which has, espouses Marxism, Leninism as its founding ideology. There's just not going to be a lot of space for political pluralism writ large. And I think that in Vietnam, not as extreme as in China, where I think the past decade has seen really severe closure, even beyond where things were a decade ago. I think Vietnam has also been moving at least somewhat the same direction, and as has Cambodia. So I think Cambodia is also kind of rejoining Vietnam and China as a single party state effectively. And that basically means any civil society, any pluralist expression of free opinion, be it religious or otherwise, is going to be, facing, will be in their crosshairs. And again, this is one of these, what's the baseline? This is not just something that's new in Vietnam. This, again, one has to appreciate this is a long lasting problem. And this is something where, there aren't many sources of potential anti-regime mobilization in Vietnam, and religion, is one of them. So they're going to be very allergic to religious expression in Vietnam, more so than in a lot of the other cases in Southeast Asia, for sure.
Commissioners, I don't know if you have any input on that as well. Putting you on the spot. Well,
since you're putting me on the spot, I ask this probably primarily to Dr. Slater, but I'd be curious about Hisham too. Is there a sense that a number of countries in Southeast Asia are purposely following the Chinese model in regards to, I don't know, the sinification of religion and the sinification of civil society in general? Is that a pattern that's being pursued intentionally, or is this just happening, domestically?
I think it's basically happening domestically. Southeast Asia doesn't need to look to China for inspiration in terms of how to, these questions of keeping religion in check, keeping civil society in check. Southeast Asia has plenty of homegrown varieties of authoritarian rule that have been around for a very long time. As with on the economic side, again, I think that a lot of what's, China is kind of a latecomer to the region in terms of its economic development. So countries aren't looking to China. Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia have been, pursuing rapid export-led growth for a lot longer than China has. So these are very, very proud sovereign countries. I think it's important to recognize. And even Cambodia, which I think has probably tilted more toward China. I mean, Laos accepted. Cambodia, I think, is tilted more toward China than any other major country in Southeast Asia. And even Cambodia, I think, is still very, very kind of committed to keeping relatively balanced external dependencies and not becoming just a client state of China. And so I don't think Southeast Asia is a kind of flat terrain where China gets whatever it wants. I think that there's a lot of, it's a very, very contested terrain. And that's how Southeast Asian governments like it. They want to see a lot of different parties, a lot of different investors, a lot of different countries that are offering markets, offering security assistance, you name it, to these governments. So it's a very cluttered field. And I think that, again, this to some degree, I guess, answers your earlier question too about the transnational versus the national. On this question, I really would prioritize the national dimension more than the transnational, although some of these sort of
Russian invasion in Ukraine kind of comes to mind with you. Cambodia is very proud that it kind of broke free and asserted it, hey, we have an independent foreign policy, independent of our economic connections with China and Russia. It really illustrates the point. I'm wondering if we can go. Oh.
Yeah. So can I just add one thing?
Yes.
Since we started by talking about ASEAN, right? And I thought Commissioner Curry gave a nice overview of what the purpose of ASEAN was. But one thing I would put more emphasis on is ASEAN came about to basically fight off interference. Okay. It was certainly anti-communist, but the main point was these countries did not want to be, pure pawns or, grass between elephants in the Cold War. They really, really wanted to prevent intervention in their internal affairs. And this is really vital for thinking about these questions of, kind of religious freedom and how to support religious pluralism in places that are extremely allergic to. Again, very proud of their own, sovereign potentialities and what they've achieved, especially economically over the past 50 years or so. And these are places that are going to not take very kindly to interference in what they perceive as interference in, and I'm sure you've encountered this as a commission, in their internal, what they see as their internal affairs, especially on this most sensitive of issues of religion and public life.
That's important to note. I'm wondering if you could provide any context on the upcoming Thai elections for May. Do you see it as empowering perhaps Buddhist groups that were calling or have been calling in the past decade for harsher penalties against blasphemy? Do you see it affecting the stability of the Thai Deep South with the Muslim regions? Any information on that?
Nothing specific. I mean, I think that it's definitely something to watch. My sense is that a lot of the anti-lesa majestad laws and a lot of the increased protection of the monarch was really surrounding the transition and the passing of the late monarch. And it's certainly my hope that as that gets further and further in the rearview mirror, that not just the monarchy, but the military is also going to, recognize that, it's really not solving any problems by maintaining strict military control over the political process. And that opening things up is going to be something that they can start to countenance. So I think, again, it's a world of difference from Burma, right? Where I think that there's been, such a violent jettisoning of the reform process in incredibly self-defeating ways and just incredibly tragic ways for the country and for the people of Burma. I think Thailand's a very far cry from that. I think elections are again, occasions to watch carefully, but if anything, I would say that we might be more likely to see more loosening rather than more tightening as elections come along in Thailand. That would be my hope, but partly because it's tightened up so much over the past 5 to 10 years. So again, if you think about Thai history, it's definitely this is one of the more restrictive, tightened periods in its history. Certainly post 1973. The last 50 years. So I would say it's a place to look maybe to think about how to try to play a constructive role in helping pluralist forces there, because I think they could be on the front foot in the years to come.
Commissioners, we have about 4 minutes left. I don't know if we have any final thoughts or questions we'd like to get to. Of course, we could go on for a few more hours, but cognizant of our time, especially over in Kuala Lumpur. Open the floor back up to you.
Well, I just want to thank you both for your input. It's been really interesting. Very quickly, because I know we only have a couple minutes. How do you see the ASEAN members? Obviously, there's been a lot of these refugees that have spread out from the Burma crisis. There hasn't been a great response. Does it seem like the ASEAN countries realize the failure of the community of nations around Burma to respond, or is there any sort of acknowledgement of this human tragedy there in that region, in your view?
Hisham, do you want to say anything about from Malaysia perspective on this one?
Sure. I think we've been really hostile towards immigrants, even though there's a selective solidarity when it comes to immigrants around in the region. I think when it comes to the issue of Palestinian conflicts, right, Muslims in Malaysia are quick to defend, but when it comes to Myanmar or Rohingya in the regions, they do not necessarily as friendly. I think to a great extent because probably because of the way that they view these immigrants personally in everyday day-to-day life. And then second, probably they actually they actually trust the ruling government when it comes to resources not being enough, buying into the rhetoric of they're going to take away your job, they're going to take away your resources and all that, and how giving them the citizenship will not solve anything, and as we will invite more people to Malaysia. I think for now I don't see anything positive or concrete from the Malaysian government. Previously, when there's this one case of immigrant which has been covered by Al Jazeera in Malaysia, what happened was the Malaysian government tries to shut the office of Al Jazeera in Malaysia, and I don't see or understand I don't see this going positively, and I'm not sure what is the trajectory following to this in the future for Malaysia.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that ASEAN has not really stepped up, but again, ASEAN doesn't exist to do a lot of things, to be honest. ASEAN is there to kind of maintain this cohesion, So I think one way to think about ASEAN, so you would never try to, Europe now, you would never try to exit ASEAN because of things they demand on you to do. You exit the European Union because they actually make demands of you. ASEAN doesn't demand much of you. And these are again, very nationalistic governments. And this, I think, also is a global trend. I think that we see, in Europe and the United States, we do see a lot of, I think, increasing hostility toward even refugees, even asylum seekers. So right now, this is, I think, a global problem we have to be thinking about. I'll be thinking about how to increase people's, appreciation for what it means to be an asylum seeker, what it means to be a refugee fleeing violence, fleeing persecution, and hopefully everyone can, find ways to be a little bit more open during these, the times of so many crises, from Ukraine to Burma and so forth. So it's not only a Southeast Asia problem by any stretch.
Commissioner Schneck, any final comments or questions for Alice?
I'm so impressed with the testimony today. So I just want to thank Hisham and Dr. Slater. This has just been very informative, and I really appreciate it. And if you don't mind, to both of you, I'd like to follow up privately on some of these matters. Thank you all.
I'd be honored. Thanks, Commissioner.
Well, with that, I want to echo our commissioner's gratitude for your time, your expertise, and for everything presented here. I'd like to thank also Commissioners Curry and Schneck for leading this important and timely conversation. I'd like to also thank just some people on our staff, Danielle Ashbahian, our Chief of Public Affairs, and Veronica McCarthy, our Public Affairs Associate. To the audience and to the panelists, if you'd like to learn more about USCIRF's work, I encourage you to visit us at www.uscirf, that's USCIRF, uscirf.gov. And we look forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries and other issues in the months ahead. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next time on USCIRF Conversations. Thank you very much. All right. Bye, everyone.